So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We don't want to penalize those of you who came on time, so we'll try and start now. My name is Maria Socorro Mangiat. I'm with the Law Division of the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi. In particular, I am from the National Environmental Law Unit, and our mandate is to assist countries in translating their environmental priorities into domestic legislation, and when domestic legislation is in place already, to strengthen the capacity of countries to actually implement and enforce legislation. We're very excited to have you here. Some of you might have been to our side event in May, where we gave you a glimpse of what we were trying to build, this Law and Climate Change Toolkit, which now we're proud to say we've actually built. It's still under construction, but we have enough to share with you and hopefully get feedback on. The journey began about a year ago when several institutions, both within the UN and outside, got together in London to talk about the importance of law in empowering countries to take climate action, not just on NDCs, but with a particular focus on NDCs. And what we realized in December was that there were so many initiatives within the international community and also in countries to try and provide adequate legal responses to the challenge of the climate regime, and in particular the Paris Agreement. So we began with that conversation and a dream to try and bring together these various initiatives and to provide users, mainly those from countries, policymakers, but also others like academics, with a resource that would allow them to see what is out there, to celebrate the achievements that have already been accomplished by way of law, and also to assist those countries that have taken a decision to adopt legislation or to develop legislation or even to review legislation, to provide those countries with a tool that would allow them to do it in an interactive manner, taking into account that what we have right now is a nationally driven approach. So the traditional approach that you might be used to is seeing model laws. That is what is used in other multilateral environmental agreements. But in the case of the Paris Agreement, we were keenly aware that such a model would not work. And so what we've tried to build from that time on is an interactive toolkit, one that will become publicly available, and I'll talk about that later, that allows a user to see what is available in terms of climate legislation around the world and how you could assess your laws or the legal situation in your country to see where there are any gaps and what could be done or what has been done by other countries to address those gaps. So in this journey, we have three core partners. So there's UN Environment, there's the Commonwealth Secretariat, and also the Climate Change Secretariat. So we have been the core partners that have been trying to build this toolkit. We have worked with other partners, and you will see the list when we get to the demonstration of the toolkit. These are partners who have helped us in the conceptual development of the toolkit and hopefully who will support us in its further development. So that's just a brief introduction of what we'll try to present here. So just to give you an overview, so we'll have some welcome messages from the Climate Change Secretariat and the Commonwealth Secretariat. Then we will give countries who've been struggling with the challenge and opportunity of developing climate legislation, give them the opportunity to tell us their story and to indicate why a toolkit and other tools that are being developed would be useful for them. And then we go into a demonstration of the toolkit. We will also have a demonstration of something called a legal advice portal, which is closely related to what the toolkit will try to deliver. And then I will come to next steps, and hopefully we'll leave you also with enough time at the end of this to provide us with some initial questions and feedback on the toolkit that we are trying to build. So with that, I'd like to first turn to Ms. Hafida Layuel, who is the Director of the Legal Affairs Program of the Climate Change Secretariat. Hafida, please.
So first I should apologize because I won't be able to stay after the welcome words or the introduction. But I'm very, very excited to be here. It is actually today, this week is my first COP. So I can really understand the benefit of having such a legal toolkit being put together to help countries. But anyway, to start with, thank you. Actually, I should also say a very big thank you to all our volunteers. The UNFCCC has sent out a message for volunteers to help with all the events that we're holding during those 2 weeks, and we've had an amazingly overwhelming response, so thank you. But first, I should first go back to the basics. As we are nearing universal participation in the Paris Agreement, we now have 169 convention parties which have either ratified or adhered to the Paris Agreement. We must now focus on how we can facilitate the implementation to the agreement and of the parties' nationally determined contributions. The parties to the Paris Agreement have understood that for implementation to succeed, solid legal foundations are essential, including effective regulatory institutional measures, and sustainable budgetary arrangement. A significant increase in laws and regulatory framework to address climate change in countries around the world is being observed. This is a very positive development for us, as these regulation and legislation not only provide a roadmap for implementation, but they give certainty and help attract public and private investment. For most countries, making sure that priorities and goals set out in their NDCs, their nationally determined contribution, have effective legal underpinning. This involves review and enhancement of existing laws and regulation. Some countries seem to have opted for or are considering framework climate acts. Others focus on their review of priority sectors, such as energy, transport, agriculture, or disaster risk management. Most countries are also reassessing their fiscal arrangements. While each regulatory measures always depend on the respective priorities, needs, and national circumstances of the countries, all countries should be able to benefit from the experience of others and from lessons learned, in particular respect of success story, but also in terms of challenges and obstacles that countries faced to become successful. So this is where the online database currently being developed by international institutions such as the UNFCCC, the UN Environmental Programme, and other non-party stakeholders. And we call this toolkit the Law and Climate Toolkit. Those three core partners, including the Commonwealth Secretariat, Stephen, are working together with other partners to provide a global resource to help countries put in place the legal frameworks necessary for effective national implementation of the Paris Agreement and their NDCs. Indeed, for us, the focus of our work is the need of countries. And this is for us why today's event is so important. And we want to have time to hear your views. We today have two representatives from two island states with us, the Republic of Maldives and Antigua and Barbuda. So we'll be looking forward to hearing about their experiences and efforts into moving into the implementation mode of the Paris Agreement. And a first beta version of this toolkit will be presented later by our partner, the Commonwealth Secretariat. We will also have a demonstration from one of our other partners, like we were told, the Legal Response International on the Legal Advice Portal. During these two presentations, we'll seek feedback from the audience. For us, this is again a critical step, as we must make sure that the toolkit is designed to meet countries' needs. Your feedback will be designed to meet, for us to understand the scope and natures of your need. We need to determine whether the toolkit is sufficiently practical and useful to countries. So I'm just going to push this away, including on technical assistance issues and support. So let me also stress another very important component of the toolkit, namely the perspective of the long-term and continuous learning. It is our hope that the legal toolkit will provide users with information and experience, not only on what the law of a country on a particular subject says, but also whether and how it works. This is really about lesson learned at this stage. So it is our intention to collect experiences throughout the process as countries go through the cycles of successful NDCs and their implementation. So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear volunteers, I wish all of us a very rich exchange which will carry our work to facilitate the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, I have to leave now, but one of my colleagues is going to step in, and we will also have another colleague from the legal affairs of the UNFCCC who will be able to respond any of your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafida, and good luck with providing the legal advice that is needed all over the process. We now have introductory remarks that will be given through a video address by the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland.
Wanted to convey my greetings and to offer my heartfelt endorsement and commendation as you gather for a demonstration of the pilot version of the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. I greatly look forward to joining you in Bonn next week for the COP. At present, I'm in the Caribbean visiting Commonwealth countries devastated by the recent hurricanes. The destruction to homes, infrastructure, lives and livelihoods I'm witnessing reveals the disturbing clarity, the extent and existential nature of the threat from climate change and extreme weather to small island states. It provides sobering context for your work on the Law and Climate Change Toolkit, which is a most encouraging product of the UNFCCC, UN Environment and Commonwealth Secretariat partnership. I acknowledge with gratitude the commitment to this project of our partners at UNFCCC and UN Environment, and thank them too for their support to Commonwealth countries on implementing the Paris Agreement and Convention on Climate Change. Together, and with inputs from other organisations and individuals throughout the world, we are developing what promises to become a definitive global resource. The toolkit assists member countries towards fulfilling their commitments and responds to the 2015 Commonwealth Leaders' Statement on Climate Action, which underlined the importance of practical and swift action to reinforce the outcomes of the Paris Climate Conference. Important in this regard is the use of national law to support the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. While national climate change policies can have an influential impact on climate action, their legal significance will depend on the legal doctrines and cultures of each country. The non-binding nature of policies renders them vulnerable to revocation or marginalisation and to competition from other policies and interests. The main advantage of legislative measures is the entrenchment of these measures in the country's legal architecture, making them less susceptible to repeal or dilution. This, in turn, promotes consistency in decision-making and reduces uncertainty. Both are critical factors in encouraging investment in climate technologies as countries pursue mitigation and adaptation goals. When Commonwealth law ministers met in the Bahamas last month, they highlighted the value of knowledge sharing and the identification of good practice on law reform in support of climate goals. Law ministers stressed the need for practical, and technical assistance in dealing with the challenges of climate change that focuses on national implementation of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. The Law and Climate Change Toolkit is a very significant means to streamline and accelerate progress towards that end. The pilot version of the toolkit is the product of the Commonwealth Secretariat's collaboration with the UNFCCC and the UN Environment. This work has included the development of a detailed taxonomy and legal assessment questions on climate law based alongside other inputs on helpful consultations with 4 Commonwealth countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Jamaica, and Vanuatu. The urgent need for the toolkit, particularly among the many small and more vulnerable island states of the Commonwealth, is and was impressed upon me as I visited and consulted with national leaders. During my current travel in the stricken islands of the Caribbean, I'm being made particularly aware of the value of this contribution and of other Commonwealth support and solidarity. We must stand together to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change, seizing new opportunities for regenerative development and cooperating to build resilient and reduce vulnerability. It is in this spirit of Commonwealth goodwill and mutual support that I wish you every success as you move forward with the pilot and with further development of the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. Thank you so much for your contribution and for making the difference.
Thank you, Ms. Scotland. So we now move to the second part of the side event, which is hearing from countries themselves. As Ms. Scotland has said, there was consultation with particular countries, not just on the side of the Commonwealth, but also on the part of UN Environment and the Climate Change Secretariat, to see what kinds of needs these countries had in terms of supporting them with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and in taking climate action. And so we've invited representatives of 2 countries to give us a flavor of the types of needs that they have expressed to us before we actually show you what we've done with the toolkit. So with that, I'd like to start by inviting His Excellency Mr. Abdullahi Majid, the Minister of State of the Republic of Maldives, to give us a short intervention on the experience of the Maldives in developing climate legislation. Sir, thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Madam Moderator, representatives of UNEP, the Commonwealth, and the UNFCCC, distinguished fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, may I thank you most sincerely for your kind invitation extended to me. Let me congratulate UNEP for conducting such an important work in developing the Law and Climate Toolkit to assist countries to strengthen their legal framework towards implementing climate change actions, particularly the NDC implementation. As you're all aware, climate change is the most serious and most pervasive threat facing humanity today. The IPCC findings confirms that warming of the Earth's surface is unequivocal. If left uncontrolled, impacts of climate change to human and environment are unprecedented and will continuously affect lives of future generations. This is why we are all working towards addressing this pressing issue facing the entire humanity today. Maldives, being one of the most vulnerable countries to the adverse impacts of climate change, has always vigorously fought and continues its effort towards addressing climate change impacts. Our efforts are not limited to adaptation and mitigation. We equally emphasize on strengthening climate change governance, particularly on strengthening our legal frameworks towards addressing climate change actions at national level. We strongly believe climate governance is an important issue we need to address to advance our continued efforts and work towards achieving the targets we have identified in our NDC. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to highlight here that environmental protection, integrity, and intergenerational equity is enshrined in our Constitution. Article 22 of our Constitution very clearly stipulated that. To address the issue, the government has been developing legal tools and instruments to support the implementation works of constitutional obligations. For example, we have Environmental Protection and Preservation Act and related regulations and standards in place to enhance our efforts to regulate the environment, biodiversity, and nature conservation. As we progress our work towards implementing and enhancing climate actions, we have decided to develop a Climate Change Act which will help us to strengthen our ongoing adaptation and mitigation efforts and mainstream climate change agenda into national development planning processes and strengthen climate change governance with the involvement of all stakeholders on decision-making process. We envisage that the proposed Climate Change Act will serve as an action plan that lays out the strategies, initiatives, and activities to prepare the country to the inevitable effects of climate change as identified in our NDC. Maldives NDC submitted to the Paris Agreement has provisions strengthen climate governance as part of our efforts to strengthen and enhance our climate change actions. Viewing climate change as an issue that must be everyone's issue, the Climate Change Act will be an effective domain to set up a dialogue, discussion, and participation regardless of people's political and other affiliations. It is important to reorganize that we all learn from experience from each other on developing and implementing the legal frameworks towards implementation climate change actions, and particularly the NDCs. Addressing the adverse impacts of climate change requires good governance and adequate capacity. Education, training, and public awareness remain as key priorities. We strongly believe UNEP, amongst others, may continue its efforts towards supporting our efforts to strengthen and implementing our legal frameworks towards achieving the targets of NDC. Ladies and gentlemen, we must unite more vigorously in the scourge of climate change for us, for our children, and to our grandchildren. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister Majid. We'd now like to turn to Antigua and Barbuda, which is represented by Ms. Aisha Baston, who will tell us about their climate legislation story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is it this one? Yes. Thank you very much. Many thanks to the Commonwealth Secretariat and other distinguished guests. Thank you for the invitation to be here. The government of Antigua and Barbuda is very grateful to the Commonwealth Secretariat for their continued support, and we hope that we will continue to have good relations in the future. We do look forward to this new toolkit because we have, yes, it's too close. because we have several difficulties, but I would like to just give you a brief overview of the legislation first, because we actually do have a fairly good piece of legislation dealing with environmental management and protection in Antigua, but of course we need further support in this regard. So first of all, I'll just give you a general overview of what we do have, and then we will speak about the challenges. So I will try to make it brief when I talk about legislation, because persons often fall asleep when we get too detailed about laws. So first of all, if you look at the features of the legislation, I will just give you a very brief outline. Right, so basically what the legislation does that is very important is that it places a special fund. We have a special fund that deals with environmental implementation in accordance with the different international treaties and so on. It's under the government, but the environmental department has a very good focus on it. They have their hands on it, which is quite good in that we don't have to wait through a very long process of trying to get into the general funding under the government. So it is a bit easier to access funds. Now in terms of management, there's a general board, and then there are thematic funding windows, which I will get into a little later. Our various funding sources are from the government or international environmental funds, private donors. The fund is self-sustaining, It uses different financial instruments like concessional loans, private equity, debt for nature swaps. Okay. Now in terms of the Yes, in terms of the organizational structure, basically you have the department, where the fund, which I spoke about, is the department's statutory mandate. So there's no getting away from the priorities that we have under environment. Then the fund itself has a general board with various representatives from the government, from NGOs, well, of course, different parts of the government and NGO bodies, civil society. Then there are thematic windows within the fund itself, which involves the private sector and civil society, like NGOs. Now, this is important in terms of access and participation, and one of the things that have been good about the Act is is being able to access these funds, because we all know how difficult it can be to have a project and to not be able to access the funding needed and to have a lot of delays within government. Okay, so the legal framework, as I spoke about. So there's the act that I've been talking about, the Environmental Protection and Management Act. Then we have several regulations that make it possible. And we even recently have draft regulations which particularly focus on the Paris Agreement. It's not on the slide because it's quite recent, but it specifically deals with implementation and NDCs. Now, I will get right into the problems that we have. So basically, we have a very good legal basis. We have an act that can be used, and it encompasses all of these different areas that are important, such as policies, management, monitoring, incorporating international obligations. It's very useful, but our problem is that we don't always have the capacity. We don't have the technical capacity. We are a small island, and as you saw, after the natural disasters, Barbuda was flattened, so we are even more constrained. So despite having good legislation and funds, we still have problems where we have to retain our staff. So let's say we have different persons are trained to deal with the legislation or with different parts of technical expertise and implementation. These persons may leave after 5 years. Perhaps there just isn't enough to keep them going in the country, to keep them on island. We also have the technology constraints, so we would really benefit from a toolkit in terms of making the process more efficient, making it more useful. It would speed up the process as well. So, and we also need legal expertise because we only have limited staffing in the Attorney General's chambers and even within Environment itself. Sorry. Yes, so there are still many glitches and many problems, and although we have a good basis, we need to push further. So we are quite happy for any assistance that the Commonwealth will provide, and we look forward to this new toolkit. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Aisha. So we now go to the third part of our side event, which is the demonstration of the toolkit and the legal advice portal. So I think that's what you've been waiting for, so I won't waste any time and introduce now Stephen, who will run us through the toolkit.
Thank you very much, Maria, and distinguished guests, Your Excellency Majid from Republic of Maldives, distinguished representative from Antigua Barbuda, and distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This, in the next 15 minutes, will be a demonstration of the pilot version of the Law on Climate Change Toolkit that has been developed by the three organisations over the last 12 months. Could I just have this computer on the screen now, please? Thank you. As Maria mentioned in her opening remarks, the main users of the toolkit are intended to be policy managers within governments, both those responsible for developing overarching climate change legal policy, but also in different sectors, such as forestry, such as energy, such as transport, health, natural resource management, etc. And indeed, one of the premises of the toolkit is that we are not just concerned with overarching climate change laws, like a Climate Change Act, but the toolkit aims to support countries across what we call intersections between climate change and national law. And so in many different sectoral laws, of course, issues related to mitigation, adaptation, or climate financing, access to technologies may arise. And the toolkit will in due course be extended to cover all of these sectors. At the moment, however, we, in the pilot version, as I will show you shortly, have limited ourselves just to two sectors, which is overarching or framework climate change laws and energy laws. I will just again, before delving into the toolkit, thank the contributing partners. We have had a really encouraging response from a very broad range of organisations, including UN entities such as UNCTAD, UN Habitat, and I should mention FAO as well, in addition to a very valuable input from academia, including the Grantham Research Institute, represented with us by Elena today, UCL and the School of Transnational Law, Peking University, and Legal Atlas. Let's look into the toolkit and show you some of its functionality. We start with a legislation explorer, and this looks very much like any sort of legal database that many of you, I am sure, are familiar with using. But of course, it is tailored particularly to looking at laws where there is an intersection with climate change issues. What we have done is to develop a taxonomy which looks at specific legal areas and attempts to break those down into quite a high level of detail regarding provisions that are typically seen within laws, within climate-related laws. So, for example, if we look at the area of dedicated climate laws and governance, we see sub-areas such as mitigation strategies or adaptation measures, the establishment of a national climate body, monitoring, reporting, verification obligations, etc. And each of those breaks down into separate sub-areas. So, for example, under the designation of climate bodies, we typically see provisions such as establishment of a coordination body on climate change or an interagency body, or provisions related to the establishment of a body with planning or regulatory powers or functions. Similarly, within the area of energy laws, we have a taxonomy related to energy production and renewable energy, but also to energy efficiency and a broader area of energy market regulation. As we add other areas such as health, oceans, forestry, land use, planning, etc., this taxonomy will grow and will be developed with levels 1, 2 and 3 in each of these other legal thematic areas. The taxonomy itself can be used to navigate the laws. So I may filter, for example, just down to overarching climate change laws, and you will see that the number of laws now displayed is only just the dedicated climate laws. At the moment, we have a relatively small number of laws uploaded, essentially for test purposes. But as the toolkit develops, we will be carrying out legal research with the aim of adding as many countries as possible, hopefully covering all parties to the Paris Agreement. In addition to the taxonomy structure, we also have what we're calling cross-cutting tags, where we have a cross-cutting theme such as the legal establishment of a duty or power for a national government or a subnational government, or a duty or a right of individuals, and these can also be used for searching. Within a particular law, let's take the Kenya Climate Change Act, in addition to being able to see the full text PDF, articles from that law have also been uploaded into the platform. The formatting will be improved in the next version, and they have had the taxonomy or classifications applied to the articles. So, for example, if we look at an article related to the Kenya Council, come to the top of the article, which sets out a particular number of obligations in law in respect of climate change powers, then we see that those are tagged in respect of establishing or designating a national climate body or function. If we look at areas of compliance, we also see that we have articles that relate to the establishment of compliance obligations. In this way, if a user is looking for a particular area in which they wish to see how countries have approached that from a legal perspective, they can search and filter using this taxonomy and tags. Similarly, we could look at the area of energy production and renewable energy. And if we take, for example, the renewable energy law of the People's Republic of China, then we can also look and see how articles have been tagged in that law. Articles 24 to 27, for example, concern renewable energy obligations and regulatory approaches, in particular fiscal incentives such as tax relief or user charges. So we can see exactly, if we're interested in implementing such a system in our own national law, how other countries have done that. That's all very nice, but of course there's many legal databases out there, and this is not a particularly innovative approach just to have a database. This is where the toolkit goes a step further, and we introduce the concept of a legal assessment. A legal assessment can be carried out for a particular country. And before I go into the assessment itself, I'll just show you the profiling capability of the portal. If, for example, I wish to carry out a legal assessment as a government policy officer within the government of Antigua and Barbuda, for example, I have a profile as Antigua and Barbuda that already contains some basic information drawn from publicly available official databases. These include the population of the country, the Human Development Index, GDP per capita, and greenhouse gas emissions data, as well as mitigation focus areas and adaptation priority sectors taken from that country's NDC, the data coming from the NDC Explorer. That means that when I'm conducting an assessment for my country, the toolkit knows the context in which I am conducting this assessment and can, as I will show you later, tailor the results that it gives you. This is only a starting point, and we're not restricted to the data that's in the toolkit. If I wish, I can edit the profile, and I can change any of those values. if I wish to try and open to the user to take the approach that they wish to do so during their legal assessment. Let me show you the legal assessment itself. The Toolkit operates on a logged-in basis, which means that each user, the work that they do in conducting a legal assessment is saved and can be accessed again later. Let's start a new assessment, for example, for Barbados. The Toolkit will then present me with a sequence of questions, at the moment related to the two areas that we're dealing with so far, overarching climate change laws and energy laws. The questions are not prescriptive. They are not going to give me a determinative result. What they are going to do is to be used as prompts within a wider policy reflection process to help users as they look at their own laws and as they reflect on how they may best be used to promote implementation of the Paris Agreement. So although questions are answerable yes or no, of course there may be a much wider and more nuanced consideration behind that. But for the moment, the questions are a simple guide to take the user through a self-reflection as to the state of their laws. So, for example, they start with, does your country have a specific law dedicated to climate change mitigation? If I say yes, I will then receive some sequence of follow-on questions, such as, does it include an economy-wide emissions reduction target? No. Oh, is there a duty then to set emission targets? Yes. Is there any other form of commitment to quantitative emissions reduction, etc.? And the Toolkit will respond in a smart way with further follow-on questions depending upon the answers to the questions that you are giving. You're not obliged to answer every question, and you may click through different areas of the assessment at will, saving the data as you continue. I won't go through all the questions because that would take quite some time to complete a full assessment. So what I will do is to show you what the results of a completed assessment would then look like. I'll go back and I'll pick up an assessment underway, for example, in the Republic of Tanzania. The questions have been answered, and I'm going to go down and I'm going to view the results. And the Toolkit is going to say to me that as a result of conducting your review questions in the area of overarching climate change laws, there are 21 potential gaps that you may wish to consider for legislative strengthening. I note again that this is not a prescriptive gap. This is simply a suggestion of an area of law that a government legal policy officer may wish to look at in further detail. In response to each of those gaps, which correspond directly to the taxonomy that is used for tagging legislative approaches to climate change, the Toolkit can suggest possible legislative areas and examples from other countries that a user may wish to consider as they look at their own legislation. So, for example, if our law does not provide for a strategic plan on mitigation or a low greenhouse gas emissions development strategy, there's an identified gap on mitigation strategies and some suggested legislations. If I click into one of those, this being an example from Ireland, we see now an article from the law in Ireland tagged with strategic plan on mitigation, and we see that within this article there's a legal approach to the requirement to make and submit a national mitigation plan in the law, and this would be a duty for the government to follow under that law. And this may be for me a source of inspiration as I look to develop my own legislation within this area. I mentioned that the idea of having an assessment profile is that results could be tailored. Within the future development of this toolkit, using the assessment profile, the toolkit will be able to tailor more precisely legislative examples that may be of particular relevance to your country. So, for example, because the toolkit knows the GHG emissions profile and adaptation and mitigation priorities from the NDC data contained within the toolkit may be able to tailor these results to take legislative examples from countries with a similar emissions profile or with a similar adaptation priority, which means that you won't just have a whole run of legislative examples, only one of which may be particularly relevant, but the toolkit would aim to give you those that are most relevant. I would say at the moment that this is, of course, not passing any comment or saying any view on the effectiveness of these provisions per se in practice. It is simply presenting legislative approaches. That, of course, is a certain limitation. The next development of the toolkit will build in a lessons learned area, where in addition to presenting the legislative examples, it will also present information gathered from in-country research and direct contact with governments and discussions as to how effective that legislation has been in practice, what have been the challenges in implementing it, how has it been applied and interpreted in practice. And that means that users would receive not only legislative examples, but they would receive information about legislative examples tailored to their most appropriate context and with further explanatory information about how those may be applied in practice. So that is the toolkit as we have it at the moment. Maria will be telling you more about the next steps. I hope that's given you a flavour of what we've been trying to produce, and of course we'll be very happy to take any questions in the discussion session towards the end of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. So, as Stephen said, the assessment, which is what we think is the key feature of this toolkit, is not a prescriptive assessment, but it could be a starting point for a program of action within a country on how legislation could be developed or improved. So a logical next step then, and Aisha also referred to this, is to look for legal experts who can then assist in further refining the results of the assessment and providing assistance to a country. And towards that end, we have Pascal from the Legal Resource International. They just changed their name recently, so to give us a sneak preview on a legal advice portal that they have been building also towards the end of assisting countries with their climate legislation. So, Pascal. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Your Excellency, distinguished panel members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, delighted to be here and very pleased to be given the opportunity to briefly present on our web portal, which is still under construction and which we have been developing in collaboration with UN Environment. Just before I start on that, I will say just a few words about who we are, what we do and how we do it. Then I will say a few words about the web portal. And then finally, I will mention possible challenges that the service might be faced with, but also the opportunities that it presents. Okay, I think I'm with it. So very briefly, who are we? Legal Response International was set up in 2009. We're a charity. We're based in London, but we work with a network of lawyers, which is global, international. We were set up by a group of NGOs and lawyers from law firms. We provide support to delegations from developing countries in the UNFCCC context. This is what we have been doing historically and what we still do now. We help typically delegates from countries who come to the negotiation with small teams who don't have access to legal advice, or they may have one lawyer on their team, but they are very much at a disadvantage compared to other bigger delegations who have lawyers, technicians who can help them. So we try and redress that imbalance by giving them access to free legal advice on a rapid response basis. The model we use is a very simple one. Basically, we are like a broker between, on the one hand, delegates and lawyers who give the advice service. So we have a small team, we attend the negotiations, we have a small team on the ground, my team is here, and we talk through legal queries with delegates. Depending on the nature of the query, depending on the complexity and its urgency, we either deal with it on the spot, respond on the spot, or more often than not, we will send the question to what we call our situation room, based in London, where we have a team of volunteers who are there ready to match legal question with lawyers on the network who have the right expertise to answer it. The advice that we provide is very much legal advice. So it is neutral. We're not a lobbying, campaigning organization. We don't get involved into setting policy agenda. We really stick to legal advice. All our advice is peer-reviewed, and it is provided by largely lawyers from large international law firms, as well as barrister chambers and also academics. The bulk of the advice is then collected into a database which you can access from our website. Before it's put on the website, it's anonymized, so there's no reference to which country or which NGO answers the question and which advisor actually answered it. In addition to the advice, we also produce briefing papers which usually will address legal questions in more depth. And in addition to that, we also provide longer-term capacity building. So the idea being that the service we offer is all and good, but it's very much ad hoc, and that ultimately, really, we need to train the lawyers whom we are trying to help so that effectively they don't need us. So we are also doing some training workshop and preparing training materials. As I mentioned before, the advice is provided on a pro bono basis. It's probably fair to say that the majority of the lawyers on our network come from Anglo-Saxon countries, primarily because the pro bono culture is more ingrained in those countries than it is in other parts of the world. However, as I mentioned, our network is international, and although the majority of the advice is prepared in English, we do have advisors who are also Francophone, French speaking, and Spanish, and so we're able to provide advice in certainly those languages as well. The motivation of the lawyers who help us are varied. Some see it as something which is strategic involvement into something that they want to be involved, new emerging areas of laws that they want to be involved in. Others do it because it's part of their junior lawyers, particularly those who come and help us in our situation room in London. They are interested in the environment, in the issues of climate change, and it's part of their training. Law firms will keep an eye on their ranking, and pro bono is one of the measurements, one of the criteria that is involved in ranking, so they may also look at that, and then others will just be involved because it's a personal interest of them. We are attentive to conflicts of interest, so there are some cases where lawyers need to recuse themselves because they can't assist, and that's fine. We are used to that, and that's fine. So, as I mentioned, we do provide advice in the context of the UNFCCC negotiation, the international negotiations, but we have already started providing advice on domestic implementation. And we have received questions which are either very general, such as, for example, please can you review a draft framework climate change bill, and suggest improvements to that, or can you suggest a mandate for a new climate change department that is being set up so that it can fully benefit from the provisions of the agreement and fully comply with the commitments under it. We also receive more discrete queries, such as, for example, can we modify existing building regulations to respond to possible sea level rise? What would be the entry points if there are existing legislation in that, and what do you recommend? Turning now to the web portal itself. As I mentioned, it is still under construction, and it's not live, so I can't show you a live version, but I will show you a few screenshots of what it will look like, and that will give you a fair idea. It's very simple. The first time you use it, you will need to register. Then you will submit a question. It may be that that question will need fine-tuning, and that will involve exchange of emails, and then eventually the advice will be produced and appear on the portal. We will then ask you to provide some feedback as to the impacts of that the advice has had, how it has been used, how useful it has been used, how useful it has been. So this is briefly what it will look like when you go into it. This is fairly self-explanatory. You will be asked first to register, country, organization, position, etc. Then register. Then you will be asked, before actually formulating your question, you will be asked to give some context to help us making sure that we have fully understood the question and fully understand what your expectation or understand what the context of the question is. You will then be asked to provide the question itself, again giving as much detail as possible, and then you will be asked to give a timeline for the response and include any documents with it. So draft bill, if it is, for example, a draft bill that you want us to assist with. Then there will be an opportunity to track the progress of your query. You will see, for example, on it when we have found an advisor, so when the query is being reviewed, is under review, and you will be given, in some cases, the chance to comment on the draft opinion, the draft advice. And again, that might involve some back and forth and exchanges of email to do that. And then we will submit on the portal the final opinion, and you will be asked to provide some feedback. In terms of possible challenges that we can see happening with the service, I think possibly timelines would be one of them, bearing in mind that the advisors who help us do that in addition to their daily work. So they can do it, but it might take longer than it possibly would otherwise do. That being said, in contrast to the kind of queries that we receive during the negotiations, where time is often of the essence, we can see that there's likely to be less urgency in relation to questions in this context. There may be some peak times as well, a significant amount of work involved, which we will have to somehow manage and accommodate. So again, we'll have. At the moment, this has not been an issue, but the web portal is not yet up and running, so we will have to see how that works. Some of the work we anticipate will be can be done remotely, and so far that's how it has worked with the advice we have provided. But there may be cases where the work would involve in-country work and travel, so that would obviously add quite a big dimension, and we would then need to address that and see to the extent to which the advisors we work with are prepared to commit to that kind of work. In terms of opportunities, as I mentioned before, we have access to a very wide, very broad network of lawyers who are very expert in this area and who have regulatory experience and are very willing to engage. We often don't have to go out and seek advisors because people are very keen to work with us, and we will also hopefully work with lawyers from the countries that we are trying to assist, from lawyers who have legal knowledge. Bear in mind, and so we are not trying to compete with domestic practitioners, and are very much aware that we can't just drop in and hope to provide all the answers, but that it is very much that it is important that it is a collaboration and a partnership with lawyers on the ground who are, of course, familiar with the specificities of the countries, the cultural and policy and political environment, which we won't be familiar with. As I mentioned already a number of times, the advice is free. I think I will leave it at that for now, but I am very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Pascal. Just a few words on next steps before we open the floor for questions, and that's the part that we're most interested in. Stephen referred already to a few things that we plan to do. So with regard to the beta version, what we are planning to do is to complete in the next few weeks that version so that it becomes available for testing. So that would mean looking at the bugs, also populating the toolkit with more laws. And in that regard, we really want to thank Alina and her team at the Grantham Research Institute, because they have been the drivers of the back-end legislative database. And then once we get the beta version complete and fully operational through our various channels of communicating, we will make that information available, and we hope that there will be countries, also researchers and others who will volunteer to help us test the toolkit. So the questions such as what Hafida was throwing out, is it practical enough? Is it useful? Are there needs that you think the toolkit can better address? So that's in the short term. Now, in the medium term, what we also want to do, Stephen was referring to a full taxonomy of laws, although the beta version is only dealing with framework legislation and energy legislation. Apart from refining the methodology in those two areas, we would like to make the toolkit operational in all the other areas of law, and to engage experts, substantive experts, as well as experts on the ground, to see how we can actually fully develop these areas of law. And then we referred to a lessons learned section, which we also hope in the medium to long term to develop. So not just to talk about what laws are out there, but what the experience has been in actually implementing these laws, what are the challenges. And ultimately, we also want to link the toolkit to work such as the one that LRI is doing on their portal, and to link it to institutions, for example, to link it to the NDC support process, and to link it to the readiness program of the GEF. UN Environment, for example, works with particular countries, and we realize that legal advice does not exist in a vacuum, and so we would really like this portal to be taken up by processes that go beyond the law and go into institution policy and fiscal incentives. So that's the presentation from all of us, but now we'd like to give you some time to give us your feedback. I'm not sure if we have a roving microphone. Oh, there is one, and one of our colleagues is holding it there. So if anyone has a question or a comment or experience to share, we have two mics actually. If you could just raise your hand, and once you have the microphone, if you could please identify yourself and indicate who you are associated with, and then, yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sunday Leonard, and I'm with the Secretariat of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel to the GEF, based in Washington. And let me say thank you for this tool. One of our work in the staff secretariat is to review GEF projects and most of the time you have projects that are referring to policies and laws and regulations. And I think this toolkit will be a very useful one to always recommend GEF agencies and countries to use in implementing their projects. But one of my questions is, it is one thing to create laws, to create regulations, but it's another thing also, especially in developing countries, to implement the laws and regulations. So my question is it possible for this toolkit to also provide, for example, in the session of the lesson learned, on what countries can also do for effective enforcement of those laws and regulation? I think that would be something that would be very useful to the countries. The second is also related to the lesson learned. So the lesson learned session can provide information on what the different, the lessons from the different countries. But is it also possible for the toolkit to be able to assess, to be able to make recommendations based on the effectiveness? So the lesson learned, I see it as a broad set of information. This is what they learn. But if I can go in and can give me examples of legislations that have been deemed to be effective based on some criteria, then that would be something that would be very useful for countries and for people involved in climate change and implementation. And then also for the robustness and broadness of the toolkit, I think, and I don't know how much you are working with scientists and other experts. I'm hoping that this is not just a toolkit that has been developed by law experts, but also with the scientists who will be able to tell you the different aspects of climate change. So, for example, there's the short-lived climate pollutant that are always that most people always ignore, but can provide immediate climate benefit and also air pollution benefit. So you might also be looking at laws that are related to air pollution, because you need to create laws that integrate these two together, or you will end up solving one problem and creating another problem. So it's important that that you work with scientists to also tell you different aspects that need to be considered in the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I think we'll take a few questions, and if we run out of time at the end, we'll be outside and we can discuss bilaterally some of the responses, because we do want to hear from as many people as we can. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Hi. So first, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your work. This is very exciting and incredible. And my name is Rachel. I'm studying environmental policy at Tufts University in the United States. Unfortunately, the United States has a completely different dimension right now, especially with the Paris Agreement. So my question in regards to this toolkit is if these laws are going to be also in a local scale available. And the second part of the question is, how do you see the United States taking this? Because what's happening now is all the local governments are starting to take initiative, because we're having such this dichotomy with the federal government. And I was wondering how state, city officials can take this toolkit and utilize it with the United States frame.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we'll take a few more questions and then.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the... Okay, let me restart again. My name is Juan Carlos Sanchez. I'm legal officer of the Environmental Law Center of the IUCN. That's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Now let me congratulate the organizers of the event. I think it's wonderful the work that you are doing. I think you're spearheading the legal work in terms of climate change, and this community, on my opinion, really needed this type of tools that you are making available. So I think we thank you for that. I appreciate Maria's remark on the sense that this is a dialogue that doesn't end here, that it's part of a continuous conversation, and in that sense the tools are being improved, they are evolving, and as such, I believe that our community interested in legal issues and also in governance issues should use these different opportunities to come together in order to understand better what is the demands that we have, but also what we can offer to the wider IUCN, to the wider climate change discussions. So I would like to use the opportunity just to invite you quickly to a next event that it's linked in a way to this one that will happen on Sunday the 12th on the IUCN Pavilion. We will continue discussing these issues. And especially there will be more in-depth explanations of the toolkit as well. But coming back to the questions, there were two issues that I would like to concretely ask. One is, how can we, the interested organizations, support that work that you are doing? How can we jump on board and be part of these exciting things that you are doing? And the second one would be, how do you tackle institutional aspects? Because there's in my opinion, a thin line between what we see as legal issues and what other people see as governance issues, and in between you have all the institutional elements. So how do you tackle institutions within the toolkits? Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's another question.
Hi, Caroline from the French delegation, youth delegate. So thank you for this toolkit. I would like to get some advice on how to introduce this toolkit to delegations, because it's not always that easy to give new tools, and if you have ideas about this. Thanks.
Thank you. I saw a few more hands up, so.
Okay, good afternoon to all. Thank you very much. My name is Ben Kamo, the national focal point from Liberia. I am a scientist, but I'm just interested in wanting to know the law. I don't know whether there is an opportunity, because you should understand, when we started this climate change negotiation, it was merely a gathering of scientists, not knowing that the legal implication is paramount. Now that we have all the scientific knowledge, but the reality is that some of us who are scientists, I think the interest is now, we want to know how best we can be trained too when it comes to drafting all these texts, all these slippery words, all those jargons. So my question is there an opportunity to train non-lawyers to be lawyers, quote unquote? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had questions over there.
Thank you. My name is Chacho Ganya. I'm a parliamentarian from Kenya. And thanks a lot for this toolkit. I've benefited so much from this toolkit a few years ago when we were working on that law in our parliament in Kenya. My question for you is, for countries like Kenya with that kind of, with the climate, with the law, do you have a segment or a component for monitoring to gauge the effectiveness of that law, and when necessary advice so that it can be amended and be more effective?
Thank you. Anyone else? I think there was.
Good day, everybody. My name is Sasha Gay Middleton. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. I'm working with the Department of Environment and also the Marine Ecosystems Protected Area Trust, which is a majority NGO board. I just want to give basically a feedback. I enjoyed the presentations given by everyone. In terms of how our implementation of our legislation works, I think it works very well. Within our Environmental Protection Management Act, it wasn't just solely drafted by policymakers. We involve the community groups, we involve the different stakeholders that is going to affect. It is mandated by law within our legislation that NGOs, civil society organizations must be involved in stakeholder consultations. The Environmental Protection Management Act addresses various different types of sectors, waste management, you name it. And the thing that we see that works is that we enter it from a bottom-up approach. So we ensure that these community groups, NGOs, they always ensure that they are part of it. So we have them on our national communities, national, I keep forgetting it. The JEF Technical Advisory Committee, we have them on these committees and we meet monthly. Have them on there and, have them represented and speaking on the different legislation and ensuring that it's not impacting them negatively. So we also, we always trying to take into consideration their concerns and ensuring that it's not being affecting them, profusely. So, I would have Ms. Ruth Spencer, she would like to share about her waste management approach as well and, the stakeholders that are variously involved in this.
I just want to say the reason that we have the local communities in our legislation development is that the laws speak about enforcement budgets. In Antigua, we have budget gaps. For enforcement, how do we carry out enforcement? It's these same local community groups that watch our countries. They have knowledge, they see what's going on, and they bring information to the Department of the Environment. So our comprehensive legislation goes across all the GEF focal areas. It's biodiversity with the ABS Nayoga Protocol. They are the watchdogs. If you come to my country and inquire about our genetic resources, our plants, what is this used for, it automatically rings a bell and they're directed, instead of just giving out all your information that you may get nothing from, go to the Department of the Environment. So I am from the NGO sector and I participate in every section. We are now developing climate change regulations in different sectors. And we meet, we put our text together, we brainstorm what's best for the country. And as a result, we have moved very far ahead. The country is accredited. It's a small country, small technical staff, but by involving other stakeholders, we were accredited to the Green Climate Fund at this board meeting. We accredited to the Adaptation Fund because the work has to be done by everybody. We want the public's information to be included in what's there. We have also, I do not know, in your baseline data, we have signed on to Principle 10. It's an environmental international treaty, and it provides for access to information, public consultation, access to justice. So our public, our people is very important, and we include them. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw one last hand. Maybe that's the last question we'll take, and then we'll try to answer your questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leila Ebo. I'm a lawyer, partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. I'm also a member of Terawatt Initiative, which is an initiative launched during COP21 by the private sector to structure the PV industry across the world and to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And one of the work stream of Terawatt is Embrogio, and Embrogio is developing currently a tool to help the states to assess their regulation in the energy sector. I don't know if you heard about this, but I think we should get in touch because I think there are some overlap between what you're doing and what the private sector is trying to achieve as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. That big clock there is telling you we have about 7 minutes. So, and I don't want to, I don't want the next event to start late. So what I'm going to do is, well, Alina's been with us, and I think I'll give her the first chance to provide insights into some of your questions because she's been patiently waiting there. So.
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just very quickly comment on a couple of questions which came up. Just to give you some background, at the Grantham Research Institute, we host a database of climate laws and also executive policies, which currently covers 177 countries. Roughly 1/3 of those are legislative acts passed by national parliaments or national assembly, and others are executive acts passed by the government. And so that database is what actually feeds into the tool. I think one question was the relationship between national and local. At Grantham Institute, at the moment, we only focus on national level legislation, and even just focusing on national, it's at the moment it's 1,380 entries that we have in the database. 585 of those roughly are laws. So if we're going to expand it to subnational level, it's a challenge to be as comprehensive as possible. So that's a challenge we had so far, to only limiting it to the national scale. But I'll let Stephen and Maria comment in terms of plans for that, for the toolkit. The question around institutional issues versus governance, that's a very good question. A lot of countries set up their institutional arrangements in laws, in which case that will be captured by the legal toolkit. Yet at the Grantham Institute at the moment, we're doing a bit of a pilot to actually understand how much of institutional arrangements are established outside of the legislation. We're trying to collect the data also based on executive orders and other sources. So we'll get a better sense of that, but we're hoping to update our database with these details on institutional arrangements on climate change. And finally, I think the question was raised by many about effectiveness of laws, and that's a very important and very tricky one to assess. And we started looking into that at the Institute at the example of the Climate Change Act of the UK, which will be 10 years next year. And it's not so straightforward, because one needs to actually decide what are the criteria that one would look at. And you can look at emissions or resilience or awareness of climate risk, but you can also look at issues as continuity and certainty provided for investors, quality of political debate, and we're currently trying to test some of those criteria. So early next year we'll have some results of that assessment, and hopefully feed into potential criteria that self-assessment in a toolkit could include for countries to comment on the effectiveness of laws.
Thank you. And may I invite Minister Majid if you have any comments on any of the questions or remarks?
Thank you very much. I think the generation of interest has been, I think, outstanding, and I'm sure time is always short for an issue like this. I have only one reaction. Of course, everybody has stated how important it is, how important the work is, and the participation is in. What sort of time frame do you envisage to complete your work? I know it's an ongoing work, but then I think you have to finish at some stage and also give people time to see how it works and how people can use it. So what sort of a time frame you have in mind?
Thank you. Aisha, any final words?
Yes, well, I found it to be very interesting. I also noted the time frames point, because we are often against time when we're dealing with legislation in Parliament. And I found it very useful that you are considering local expertise, and because that's often a problem where you don't know the context and you just give us a law, because we can't just cut and paste everything that is international into different countries and national circumstances. Thank you.
A colleague from Climate Change has joined us, Daniel, who's been working hard in the background. So any comments, Daniel?
Yeah, apologies for being late. Was caught in the negotiation support in the other zone. Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting feedback from the floor. I just will let many of the questions be answered also by Maria and Stephen. I just want to make 3 points. I think this question of local and national and state laws came up also in the event that we had in May. I mean, there's not only the United States, it's just also countries which operate very much through the federal and the national state level. I think in the principle, one may also learn from other countries' legislation of the national level for its own state level, or, I mean, it's country specific, but it doesn't mean that you cannot learn from legislative examples or techniques that are in other countries at the national level. Thank you very much also for that, pointing to the private sector initiatives. This is something we are actively exploring, not only this one, but also we're building a reference group. I don't know, maybe it was already mentioned, to try to continuously enlarge, particularly as we move into other specific sectors of sectoral laws. So partnering with also private, but also institutions like IRENA and other organizations who are active in that respect. I also want to mention, did you mention that already, that on Friday there's a Climate Law and Governance Day, where the toolkit will also be presented, and we have someone from FAO sharing their perspective on this. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Pascal, any final words or reactions to what we've heard from the floor?
No, I think that a lot of very good point. Effectiveness is obviously really key, and trying to capture that will be important. Another element as well in perhaps is to bear in mind is flexibility as the process at the international level evolves. Laws will need as well to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate that and incorporate that. So that's a sort of a general comment. I think, and it has been touched upon by some people, I think it's quite clear that there is no one-size-fits-all. There are different regulatory approaches. But I think from what I have seen, I think the toolkit will be really helpful at trying to navigate that and trying to understand that and help users. And then perhaps last comment about bottom-up approach again, following up on this idea that there's no one-size-fits-all. Bottom-up approach involving all stakeholders, including from civil society, is very important if you want something which is going to be actually implemented on the ground and have everyone's agreement and something that everyone will buy into. So that's an important point too.
Thank you. So some words from Stephen, and then I'll wrap up the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Just a few brief words, maybe just a little bit on timelines and users of the toolkit as well. I noticed interesting questions around use by non-lawyers, how to introduce the toolkit to delegations, etc. as well. I think maybe just one point is that whilst the primary user of the toolkit is intended to be government legal policy makers, really we actually envisage a potentially broad user base as well. So academia, private sector may all naturally be able to use the toolkit and use that within their own research for their own ends and for looking at their own advocacy work and policy development as well. So I think one of the things that we've tried to do is to, whilst the subject matter is necessarily quite technical, to make that as non-technical and as accessible as possible through the wording and the language we've used. So really a point that it is open to all. On the time scale, as Maria mentioned, I think in your opening remarks, there's a few bugs and things just to iron out, but we hope that before the end of this year, we will, as the three organisations, the Climate Change Secretariat, UN Environment Programme and Commonwealth Secretariat, be inviting through our channels governments to participate as a pilot within testing of the toolkit, to look at the two modules that exist at the moment and to see how those can be further developed, how they can be used. We would have a period of a few months of testing. We also need to mobilise more resources, certainly, for further development of the toolkit next year. But we would hope that throughout the course of 2018, the additional modules on the other legal thematic areas would be added with a view to having, hopefully, a fairly developed product by the end of the next 12 months or so. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a few final words on best practices and lessons learned, the point of the gentleman from the GEF. It's part of our dream to eventually go also into best practices of, in implementation and to look at lessons learned and somehow to integrate that into the assessment tool. But you will recognize and appreciate that that's a more complicated business than just a straightforward rendering of what laws are out there. On the question about capacity building in general in the law, I'm very glad to hear from a scientist that the importance of the law is recognized. UNITAR and UN Environment actually launched an online course on the Paris Agreement and the climate change regime last week. So if you go either into the UN Environment website or UNITAR, you will see that online course. It's free, you can take it. We also have a publication on climate litigation that is available online for those who'd like to see what the trends in climate litigation are. On working with the private sector, we'd be interested to have a follow-up discussion with you afterwards, because we do want this toolkit to help users to see what's out there, whether it's our product or not. It's just to facilitate the search, because there is so much out there, and even the so-called specialists can't really keep track of everything that's being developed. And as Daniel said, there is a reference group that is helping us with refining the substance that is behind the toolkit, but we envisage that there will be subgroups for each of these areas, and we'd really like to know which of you can help us. And other ways of helping, we can discuss bilaterally. As I said, we will be out there for a few minutes, and you'll see us around. Also, there will be another presentation at the Climate Law and Governance Day, at the IUCN event on Sunday, at the Capacity Building Day next week. But take a close look at us. If you see us, you remember a question, just stop us and we'll be glad to have a coffee or to have a chat with you. So thank you very much.